Hello, good morning. I'm Lucian Informative, and my topic I will explain in a minute, but I'd like you to perceive this. So imagine you're living as everything now, but we're all ruled by the French. That is a possible outcome that this reality could have taken if what I'm explaining today took place. So my topic, I will be outlining the consequences of Napoleon I's unsuccessful Russian military campaign. So I've done extensive research on this, and I'm a personal fan of a very famous novel called War and Peace, which is a book written by Leo Tolstoy, which incorporates a lot of philosophies about this particular campaign that occurred. I'll be discussing with you today a little bit of background information on the key players in the event, the casualties of the war and the setting, and finally the lasting consequences that Napoleon incurred because of the conflict. So to begin with, some of the key people you should know is Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte I of France. Hopefully most everyone knows who Napoleon is. He was originally a military officer in the Kingdom of France, and then after they killed the king, he kind of used that power gap to secure a position. He made these ludicrous positions of power like consul, and then he finally claimed himself emperor. And at first people were a little confused about him, but later he went on to perceive more of a militaristic pattern. He started invading lands that would lead him to soon invade Russia. So he was the main player of invading, and the people who were against him was the Tsar. The Tsar is the ruler of Russia, and it was Alexander I at the time. He is part of a long line of Romanovs that have been ruling Russia for many, many hundreds of years. And even though that Napoleon was leading the army, he wasn't per se leading the army on the front lines. That was this guy named Kutuzov. He was a field marshal. Little fun fact, they only paint him on this side because he has a glass eye, because he was shot in the head twice during other battles against Napoleon, so he definitely has the background and hatred towards Napoleon for it. So he would be the main army leading, and some more background, this is the coalition. Coalition is what they would call a group of other countries that were trying to fight Napoleon. And to put in perspective, there were 7 coalitions, and he beat every single one except for the 7 that finally took him down. So the one I will be describing is called the 6th Coalition. Napoleon's army, it was called the Grand Army. It was considered a modern marvel and had all the military advancements of the age. And just a quote you should know, there is no doubt that Napoleon, more than any other general of his time, appreciated the power of public relations. That was written by Ralph Buffard, a historian, who was describing that Napoleon was really a modern monarch because he really cared about his soldiers. He was always the first one in the front lines, and he would always make sure that his men were up to standards and were really loving their cause. So that my next was the Russian campaign. So to put in perspective, by the way, disregard these numbers, only look at the people, because this is actually lower than how many were actually in it. So Napoleon's Grand Army, the whole invading force, was 685,000 soldiers when they crossed the Niemen River, which is considered Russian territory. So once they crossed that river, they were formally invading Russia. And the Russians only had 488,000 men. So they were definitely at a disadvantage to begin with. This conflict lasted for about 1.5 years. Their grand goal was to get to Moscow, which has always been the Russian sacred capital. Napoleon wanted to get there, capture it, and then capture the Tsar and end the war. But it didn't really play out as he thought because of a lot of factors that include the civilians. The Russians really hated the French, or they hate any foreign invaders, so the civilians would take up anything they could use to fight Napoleon. So gradually, I really like this graph because if you can see, this is the number of soldiers. Even when it gets here, it starts decreasing, decreasing, decreasing. You can't see, but the little gray part is how many men he lost. And then the blue represents his invading force, and the red represents his retreating force. So he made it all the way to Moscow, but actually when he got there, the Russians decided to burn it to the ground rather than let him take it. So he was just so unprepared for this. His army was completely shattered that he actually retreated, and even worse, he was attacked multiple points in the way when he was retreated. So to put in perspective, the 685,000 men he brought, 530,000 of them died all the way through, and 35,000 of those were his imperial guards, which were said to be the greatest warriors in Europe at the time. The Russians, though, they lost 2/3 of their army, so they definitely didn't win when it regards to loss of life. Other reasons for death was disease, hypothermia, because when he retreated, winter started, so that was one of the main reasons, and local resistance. So then my next point. This is the point I want to talk about his overall consequences of his decision to invade. So soon after Napoleon retreated and recrossed the Niemen line, his army urged him to go to Paris to start raising troops again. Unfortunately, he did not have enough time to rearm, and by then the final coalition was raised to fight Napoleon. He would bring the fight to Spain and England, where he was defeated at the Battle of Waterloo. His army was forever shattered, and he was deposed. He was later sent to a small island called Elba, where he would live comfortably, but still in exile. His army was broken up, and the coalition that invaded, they reinstated the old monarchy, which everyone did not like. His marshals, particularly, were disheartened by this news, and one of them, a very famous Louis Alexandre, who was the leader of this whole campaign, he actually killed himself by jumping out of his window because he said, I couldn't accept this outcome with Napoleon. And after that, the Grand Army would never again be raised. So then, to finish it off, this quote, the emperor is on the point of advancing towards you. If you fire, he will be the first to fall, and you will answer for it to the whole of France. This is a famous quote that kind of portrays Napoleon's whole image at the end of his career, and that goes along with this picture, which shows him retreating. That even though Napoleon was badly beaten, all of his enemies looked down on him. Even after Elba, he came back, he kept coming back, and he even reconquered his old empire, but then it was taken again from him. So it really is to show that even though all these consequences occurred to him and he lost his kingdom, Napoleon's character is that of a survivor. So, thank you.
So Giovanni, you got some comments?
Yeah. I can say that he really, he had care for this project and he put a lot of effort into it. I can see that, like all the slides, and he provided excellent background information. I can tell, like, during the conclusion there wasn't any. He just started off by saying thank you, and pretty much it.
All right. Well, I like the visualization as an attention device at the beginning. I do think you probably want to come back to that and explain why we're not all speaking French. The consequences of the unsuccessful military campaign, I thought that made sense. Also, ultimately, though, you're talking less about the consequence and more about why what the campaign was and why it was unsuccessful. There is a little bit about the consequence at the end, and I did think you're trying to squeeze in the whole history of Napoleon after the retreat from Moscow in the last minute and a half of the speech. Is like, well, that seemed like maybe a highlight a point or two you were trying to do, I think, more than you actually could do in that amount of time. So that I felt a little concentrated there at the end. At first, I didn't hear the citations, and then in the middle of the speech, I started hearing a couple of citations. At the end, you give us a citation for a final quote. That's okay also, although it seems like it's kind of an abstract quote. Some of the information that I think we need to have a little bit more citation for concerns the troop numbers, especially when there's a discrepancy between what you've got on the visuals, and you're telling us there's a discrepancy. So why should we believe the numbers you have instead of the numbers that are there? There's a reason for that. You could tell us that. There's a very good preview at the beginning of the speech, and I thought it was pretty well organized. It's chronological for the most part, but the transitions between the supporting points are often abrupt, and it just feels like you need to have something smoother that gets us from point A to point B. On the visual materials, they're pretty basic. I did think that the map with the campaign on it and with the advancing and retreating, that was pretty effective, even though the numbers were a little inconsistent. You explained that. That was, for the most part, okay. I think the first one, it was a little bit odd because you mentioned Alexander, and then we never talked about him again. You mentioned the field marshal and what he had to do in the campaign and what happened in the battles. It's not, as far as I know, nothing happened that involved him. I know he got shot twice before all of that stuff happened, so he really hated Napoleon. But I'm going, okay, so why was he critical to mention in this situation? Did he manage the troops? Did he rally the civilians? Is he the one who decided to burn down Moscow? I don't know. And that felt a little, like I said, incomplete. You set that up. Probably at the beginning, if you could arrange to have the pictures of the three figures, if you're going to have Alexander included, three figures, have them come up one at a time instead of having them all up at the same time, because it's a little bit of a distraction and it doesn't focus our attention on the thing that you're talking about at that particular moment. I'd agree with Giovanni. You seem like you're enthusiastic about the subject. You are committed to talking about it, and I think your delivery helps quite a bit. You're not going to see yourself quite as much as you might have because the camera is low here, and I'm shooting, and you just happen to be standing in the wrong place, so you can get the back of his head, but that's okay. It's all right, not a worry.